Chapter 5 The Cuban Back. The travelers left Angrostra on the 10th of July. Night had set in when they crossed for the last time the bed of the Orinoco. They purposed to rest near the little fort San Rafael, and on the following morning at daybreak to set out on their journey through the plains of Venezuela. About a month had elapsed since their arrival at Angrostra, and they were earnestly wished to reach the coast, with the view of finding at Cumana or at Nueva Barcelona a vessel in which they might embark for the island of Cuba, thence to proceed to Mexico. After the sufferings to which they had been exposed during several months while sailing in small boats on rivers infested by mosquitoes, the idea of a sea voyage was not without its charms. They had no idea of ever again returning to South America, sacrificing the Andes of Peru to the archipelago of the Philippines. They adhered to their old plan of remaining a year in Mexico, then proceeding in a galleon from archipelago to Manila, and returning to Europe by way of Barsora and Aleppo. Their mules were in waiting for them on the left bank of the Orinoco, the collection of plants and the different geological series, which they had brought from the Esmeralda and the Rio Negro, had greatly increased their baggage. And as it would have been dangerous to lose sight of their herbals, they expected to make a very slow journey across the Llanos. On the 13th, they arrived at the village of Cari, the first of the Caribbee missions. They lodged as usual at the convent. Their host would scarcely comprehend how natives of the north of Europe could arrive at his dwelling from the frontiers of Brazil by the Rio Negro, and not by way of the coast of Cumana. He treated them in the most polite manner, and at the same time manifesting that somewhat importunate curiosity which the appearance of a stranger, not a Spaniard, always excited in South America. He expressed his belief that the minerals that they had collected must contain gold, and that the plants dried with so much care must be medical. Here, as in many parts of Europe, the sciences were thought worthy to occupy the mind only so far as they were conferred some immediate and practical benefit on society. The travelers found more than 500 Caribs in the village of Cari, and saw many others in the surrounding missions. They were a tall race of men, their height being 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 10 inches. According to practice common in America, the women were more sparingly clothed than the men. The former wore only the quadjuco in the form of a band. The men had the lower part of their body wrapped in a piece of blue cloth, so dark as to be almost black. This drapery was so ample that on the lowering of the temperature towards evening, the Caribs threw it over their shoulders. The men cut their hair in a peculiar manner, very much in the style of the monks. A part of the forehead was shaved, which made it appear extremely high, and a circular tuft of hair was left near the crown of the head. The Carib women were less robust and good-looking than the men. On them devolved almost the whole burden of domestic work as well as much of the outdoor labor. They asked the travelers eagerly for pins, which they stuck under the lower lip, making the head of the pin penetrate deeply into the skin. The young girls were painted red and were almost naked. On quitting the mission of Cari, they had some difficulties to settle with their Indian muleteers. They had discovered that the travelers had brought skeletons with them from the cavern of Atarupe, and they were fully persuaded that the beasts of burden which carried the bodies of the old populations would perish on the journey. Every precaution the travelers had taken was useless. Nothing could escape a Carib's penetration and keen sense of smell. And it required all the authority of the missionary to forward their passage. They had to cross the Rio Cari in a boat and the Rio de Agua Clara by fording, or, it may be said, by swimming. They had two bad stations, one at Matagorda and the other at Los Risetos. Before they reached the little town of Pau, they beheld everywhere the same objects. Some small huts constructed of reeds and roofed with leather. Men on horseback armed with lances guarding the herds. Herds of cattle half wild, remarkable for their uniform color, and disputing the pasturage with horses and mules. The travelers arrived on the 23rd at the town of Nueva Barcelona. Less fatigued by the heat of Llanos, to which they had been long accustomed, than annoyed by the winds of sand, which occasioned painful chaps in the skin. The climate of Barcelona was not so hot as that of Cumana, but it was extremely damp and somewhat unhealthy in the rainy season. Bonpland had become well the irksome journey across the Llanos and had recovered some of his strength and activity. But Humboldt suffered more at Barcelona than at Angrostra. Immediately after their passage on the river, they remained nearly a month at Barcelona, where they found their friend Fray Juan Gonzalez, who had traversed the upper Orinoco before them. He expressed regret that they had not been able to prolong their visit to that unknown country, and he examined their plants and animals with that interest which may be felt by even the most uninformed man for the productions of a region he has long since visited. Fray Juan had resolved to go to Europe and to accompany them as far as the island of Cuba. They were together for the space of 7 months, and they found his society agreeable. He was cheerful, intelligent, and obliging. Little did they anticipate the sad fate that awaited him. He took charge of a part of their collections, and was a friend to his own confided to his care a child, who was to be conveyed to Spain for its education. Alas, the collection, the child, and the young ecclesiastic were all buried in the waves. The packet boats from Cumana, bound for Havana and Mexico, had been due 3 months, and it had been believed that they had been taken by the English cruisers stationed on this coast. Anxious to reach Cumana in order to avail themselves of the first opportunity that might offer for their passage to Vera Cruz, the travelers hired an open boat called a lancha, a sort of craft employed habitually in the latitudes of Cape Candera, where the sea was scarcely ever rough. Their lancha, which was laden with cocoa, carried on a contraband trade with the island of Trinidad. For this reason, the owner imagined that they had nothing to fear from the enemy's vessels, which then blockaded all the Spanish ports. They embarked on their collection of plants, their instruments, and their monkeys, and the weather being delightful, they hoped to make a very short passage from the mouth of Rio Negro to Cumana. But they had scarcely reached the narrow channel between the continent and the rocky isles of Borracha and the Christmas and the Chimanas, when to their great surprise they came in sight of an armed boat, which, whilst hailing them from a great distance, fired some musket shot at them. The boat belonged to a privateer of Halifax. The protestations of the travelers were without effort. They were carried on the board the privateer and the captain, affecting not to recognize the passports delivered by the governor of Trinidad for the illicit trade, declared them to be a lawful prize. Being a little bit in the habit of speaking English, Humboldt entered into conversation with the captain, begging not to be taken to Nova Scotia, but to be put on shore on the neighboring coast. While he endeavored to the captain to defend his own rights and on those of the owner of the Alancha, he heard a noise on deck. Something was whispered to the captain, who left in consternation. Happily for them, an English sloop of the war, the Hawk, was cruising in those parts and had signaled the captain to bring to, but the signal not being properly answered, a gun was fired from the sloop, and a midshipman sent on board the vessel. He gave Humboldt hopes, and that the Lancia, which was laden with cocoa, would be given up, and on the following day they might pursue their voyage. In the meantime, he invited the traveler to accompany him on board the sloop, assuring him that his commander, Captain Garner, would furnish him with better accommodation for the night than he would find in the vessel from Halifax. Humboldt accepted these obliging offers and was received with the utmost kindness by Captain Garner, who had been made the voyage to the northwest coast of America with Vancouver, and who apparently to be highly interested in all he relayed to him respecting the great cataracts of Atures and Maypures, bifurcation of the Orinoco and its communication with the Amazon. He introduced to him several of his officers who had been with Lord Macartney in China. Humboldt had not during the space of a year enjoyed the society of so many well-informed persons. They had learned from the English newspaper the object of his enterprise. He was treated with great confidence, and the commander gave him up on his own stateroom. The travelers continued their passage the next day and were surprised by the depth of the channel between the Caracas Island, where the sloop worked her way through them with almost touching the rocks. Numbers of pelicans and of flamingos, which fished in the nooks or harassed the pelicans in order to seize their prey, indicated the approach of the coast of Cumana. At sunrise, the seabirds suddenly appeared and they animated the scene, reminding the travelers in these solitary regions of the activity of the cities of Europe at the dawn of day. At 9 in the morning, they reached the Gulf of Caraco, which served as a roadstead to the town of Cumana. The hill, crowned by the castle of San Antonio, stood out prominent from its whiteness on the dark curtain of the inland mountains. They gazed with interest on the shore, where they had first gathered plants in the America, and where they, some months later, Bonpland had been in such danger. Among the cactuses that rose in the columns 20 feet high appeared the Indian huts of the Guayqueras. Their friends at Cumana came out to meet them. Men of all castes, with whom their frequent herborizations had brought them in contact, expressed the greater joy at sight of them, and a report that they had perished on the banks of the Orinoco had been current for several months. The travelers hastened to visit Don Vincente Emparan, whose recommendations and constant solicitude had been so useful to them during the long journey they had just terminated. He procured for them in the center of town a house which was extremely useful for their instruments. They enjoyed from its terraces a majestic view of the sea, and of the Isthmus of Araya and the archipelago of the islands of Caracas, Peninsula, and Baracha. The port of Cumana was every day more and more blockaded. In the vain expectation of the arrival of Spanish packets detained them 2 months and a half longer. They were often tempted to go to the Danish islands, which enjoyed a happy neutrality, but they feared that if they left the Spanish colonies, they might find some obstacles to their return. They employed their time in contemplating the flora of Cumana, geologically examining the eastern part of the peninsulas of Araya, and observing many ellipses of satellites which confirmed the longitude of the place already obtained by other means. They also made experimentations on the extraordinary refractions on evaporation and atmospheric electricity. They prolonged their stay at Cumana a fortnight, having lost all hope of the arrival of a packet from Corunna. They availed themselves of an American vessel laden at Nueva Barcelona with salt provision for the island of Cuba. They had now passed 16 months on this coast, and in the interior of Venezuela, and on the 16th of November they parted from their friends at Cumana to make the passage for the third time across the Gulf of Coriaco to Nueva Barcelona. The night was cool and delicious. It was not without emotion that they beheld for the last time the disk of the moon illuminating the summit of cocoa trees that surrounded the banks of the Manzanares. The breeze was strong, and in less than 6 hours they anchored near the Morro of Nueva Barcelona, where the vessel which was taken to them, Havana, was ready to sail. They sailed from Nueva Barcelona on the 24th. The 2nd of December they described Cape Pieta. During the night there was a very curious optical phenomenon which Humboldt could not account for. At half past 12 the wind blew feebly from the east. The thermometer rose to 74 degrees. Humboldt had remained upon the deck to observe the culmination of some stars. The full moon was high in the heavens. Suddenly, in the direction of the moon, 45 degrees for its passage over the meridian, a great arch was formed, tinged with prismatic colors, though not of a bright hue. The arch appeared higher than the moon. This iron band was near 2 degrees broad, and its summit seemed to rise nearly from 80 degrees to 85 degrees above the horizon of the sea. The sky was singularly pure. There was no appearance of rain, and what struck him most was that this phenomenon, which perfectly resembled a lunar rainbow, was not in the direction opposite to the moon. The arch remained stationary, or at least appeared to do so, during 8 of the 10 minutes, and at the moment when he tried to see if it were possible to see it by reflection in the mirror of the sextant, it began to move and descend. Crossing successfully the moon and Jupiter, it lacked 6 minutes of 1 o'clock when the summit of the arch sank below the horizon. This movement of an arch, colored like the rainbow, filled with astonishment the sailors who were on watch the deck. They alleged, as they did on the appearance of every extraordinary meteor, that it denoted wind. The travelers anchored at Havana on the 19th of December. Not being able to find a passage in any neutral vessel, Humboldt frightened a Catalonian sloop lying at Batabano, which was to be at his disposal to take him either to Portobello or Cartagena, porting as the gales of Saint Martha should permit. The travelers set sail on the 9th of March, somewhat encumbered by the smallness of the vessel, which accorded no sleeping place but upon deck. The cabin received no air or light but from above. It was merely a hold for provisions, and it was with difficulty that they could place their instruments in it. They were soon in the Gulf of Patabano, which was bounded by a low and marshy coast and looked like a vast desert. The flashing birds, which were generally at their post, whilst the small birds and the indolent vultures were at roost, were seen only in small numbers. The sea was of a greenish-brown hue, and in some of the lake of Switzerland, while the air, owing to its extreme purity, had at the moment the sun appeared above the horizon. A cold tint of pale blue, similar to which the landscape painters observe at the same hour in the south of Italy, and which makes distant objects stand out in strong relief. They sailed ESE, taking the passage of Don Cristobal to reach the rocky island of Cayo de Piedras, and to clear the archipelago, which the Spanish pilots in the early times of the conquest designated the names of gardens and bowers. The Queen's Gardens, properly so called, were nearer Cape Cruz, and were separated from the archipelago by an open sea 35 leagues broad. Columbus gave them the name they bear in 1494, and when on the second voyage he struggled during the 58 days with the winds and currents between the island of Pinos and the eastern cape of Cuba. He describes the island of this archipelago as verdant, full of trees, and pleasant. A part of the so-called gardens was indeed beautiful. The voyagers saw the scene change every moment, and the verdure of the islands appeared the more lovely from its contrast with chains of rocks, displaying white and barren sands. The surface of these sands, heated by the rays of the sun, seemed to be undulating, like the surface of a liquid. The contact of layers of air of unequal temperature produced the most varied phenomenon of suspension and mirage. From 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, even in these desert places, the sun animated the landscape and gave mobility to the sandy plain and to the trunks of trees, and the rocks that had projected into the sea like promontories. When the sun appeared on these inert masses, seemed suspended in air, and on the neighboring beach the sands presented the appearance of a sheet of water, gently agitated by the winds. A train of clouds sufficed to seat the trunks of trees and suspended rocks again on the soil, to render the undulating surface of the plains motionless, and to dissipate the charm which the Arabian, Persian, and Hindu poets have celebrated as the sweet illusions of the lonely desert.